Hello and welcome to the Scholar Circle, scholarcircle.org. I'm Maria Armoudian. In this hour, the IPCC's assessment on climate change warns us of the environmental risk if we don't take dramatic action. We'll explore the report, the state of the scientific research on climate change, and the need for political action. Doug Becker explores.
I'm Doug Becker. This month, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, released its sixth assessment report. This body, a group of scientists and specialists researching climate change and its impact on the planet, was the most stark and foreboding of any of its reports. The effects of the failure to act on the threat of climate change and the need to make immediate changes in governmental and societal practices mark the report. It comes in advance of a new round of climate change negotiations scheduled later this fall in Glasgow. On today's show, we will discuss the contents of the report, some of the impacts of climate change on the planet, and the effect it may have on future action. Our guests are Jennifer Allan, lecturer in international relations in the School of Law and Politics at Cardiff University in Wales. She's the author of The New Climate Activism, NGO Authority and Participation in Global Climate Governance. Gabriel Vecchi, professor in the Department of Geosciences and the director of the High Meadows Environmental Institute at Princeton University. He's the author of Causes of Large Projected Increases in Hurricane Precipitation Rates with Global Warming. Stephen R. Palumbi, Jane and Marshall Steele Jr. Professor in Marine Sciences at Stanford University and the Harold A. Miller Director of the Hopkins Marine Station. He is the co-author of numerous articles, including Using Naturally Occurring Climate-Resilient Corals to Construct Bleaching-Resistant Nurseries and Impacts of Biodiversity Loss on Ocean Ecosystem Services. And Pamela Chasek, Professor and Chair of the Political Science Department at Manhattan College. She is the author of several books, including Global Environmental Politics. Thank you all for joining us. Jennifer Allan, I'll start with you. Can you give us a synopsis of what this IPCC report entails?
Thanks. That's a bit of a tall order given there's two physical scientists here too, so I will try not to make them cringe. Maybe instead I'll talk a little bit about what IPCC reports do in sort of the governance landscape. It really is a chance for scientists to speak to policymakers. So it's a chance to give us a sense of what the state of science is, what we know, what we think we know, what we're worried about as scientists, and then to kind of relay that to policymakers. And the IPCC is one of these science policy interfaces because it brings those two communities together very well. And it's the last bit of it, the summary for policymakers, is negotiated in part with governments, and governments adopt it. So there's this part where it's science providing the advice, or sorry, I guess more science providing the state of knowledge, and then governments adopting that. And so that sort of interface is really important because it, in this case with the physical science basis, and that's what this IPCC report was, it let science and the scientific communities kind of raise the alarm. You know, we've heard code red, emergency, crisis, really kind of set the threat level here of climate change. And I think that's one of the meaningful messages coming from this report.
And Gabriel Vecchi, one of the things that was really striking with the report is the linkage between climate change and some of these extreme weather events. I know that's been something that the IPCC has been a little bit reluctant. I believe it's referred to as attribution. This is an area of your research. What has struck you about this acknowledgement?
So this new IPCC report, for a few reasons, I think, has laid out one of the, the strongest statements connecting changes in the likelihood of certain extreme events to man-made global warming. And this is, I think, in part, a real accurate reflection of where the science sits. I think the IPCC report is obviously a political document because it is a document that is meant for policymakers. but it should encapsulate our understanding of science, what we understand. And over the past decade, so the last IPCC report came out in 2013 and reflected scientific understanding until the publication cutoff, I believe it was in 2012. Over that past decade, we've really had an explosion in scientific effort and then the resulting understanding on what causes individual extreme events, changes in likelihood of sets of extreme events. And that has involved an improvement in the observations that are available to us, both of the historical instrumental era, but also of the paleo data, of the prehistoric data that allows us to place the present data in context. Our theoretical understanding of how large-scale climate influences events has grown, as have our modeling tools. And this convergence of methods has come also on the back of really a focused attention by the scientific community. I've played a part in that, but it's been a much broader effort involving international consortia, individual scientists, government laboratories, to target individual events as they were happening, to see what we could say about the drivers of the likelihood of those events. And I think that combined effort and new sets of tools have really allowed the IPCC to say something finally that is much more clear about the fact that when we talk about global warming, when we talk about the planet getting warmer by a degree or so, connected to that are changes in the probability of extreme events. It is not just that the thermostat in the room is going up by a degree. It is that there is a change in the likelihood of extreme rain. There's a change in the likelihood of these extreme heat events, as we've seen in much of the United States and other parts of the Northern Hemisphere this past summer. And so that connection is now much clearer than it ever has been. And I guess the other bit that is always useful to keep in mind is that every IPCC report comes after the preceding IPCC reports. And therefore, sort of the signal of global warming is unfortunately just that much clearer, right? It's gone on for that much longer.
And Pam Chasek, it seems like then there's sort of two things about this IPCC report that really is, striking as a sort of a political and a social element. And that is, first, drawing from what Gabriel just said, it's really indicating that things have gotten a lot worse. And it was meant to kind of shake some of the political lack of action on climate change. And secondly, actually coming out during a period where we're having a lot of these weather events, these heat waves and hurricanes. It's a part of this conversation. Is it fair to say that this IPCC report was really meant to be alarming to try to compel action?
I wouldn't say it was meant to be alarming. I think the science shows that it is alarming, and that this is just the first part of the IPCC's sixth assessment. This part focuses on the physical science. Two more parts will be coming out. So this is going to be a constant flow of information. That in February, they're due to approve what's known as the Working Group 2 report, which assesses climate change impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. And I think we'll see a lot more coming out of that. And then the Working Group 3 report is, in theory, going to be approved in March of next year. And then finally, the overall synthesis report that integrates the findings of all three working groups will be approved in September. But the reason they needed to get this one out now is, as you had said earlier, that you've got the Glasgow Climate Change Conference, and that the IPCC authors, as well as this approval session with governments, really went above and beyond. This was the first time they approved a report virtually, and to get this report out so that it would trigger the alarm, to hopefully push governments to take stronger actions both at home as well as in Glasgow.
And Stephen Palumbi, I mean, one area that is clearly at risk are our oceans. The impact on land is pretty dramatic, but the impact in the ocean seems to be even more dramatic. How much is this IPCC report, first of all, reflective of the science on the community that's doing this research on issues like ocean biodiversity, coral at risk, et cetera? And should we be shifting our attention, as much as we want to focus on land, we should be shifting our attention to the impact it's having on the seas?
Well, you're completely right. It has been an increasingly obvious thing that extreme events all around the world, and particularly in the ocean, are playing a huge role. And Gabriel's totally right that this IPCC report really adds more and more and more evidence that extreme events are what's really driving the crisis. And both Pam and Jen are really focusing correctly on the role that advice plays to governments, because people can see it. People can see the hurricanes coming, around on the West Coast now. You can see the wildfires going everywhere. You can see hurricanes flooding areas. In the ocean, you see all those things. And so what we see is the consequences of these extreme events, like huge storms or heating events that kill off corals, which is one of the things that we study a lot of, but also heat waves that drive down oxygen and cause fish kills, and et cetera, et cetera. So that is kind of the interface between the physical side of the environment actually going wonkers, really, and then the policy side and the human side, because that is what's affecting human communities, not just the fires and where they're living, but also their food supply, their security. I did a trip through Micronesia, pre-COVID, and virtually every little island that I went to not only had coral bleaching, but actually more alarming, every single well on every single atoll I was in had saltwater intrusion. And that's because of higher sea levels and higher wave action. And so the people on those islands are all of a sudden 1,000 years of culture and using freshwater wells is gone because of this, and they're having to adapt and using different things. So that really takes the extreme events which were in the report and really tries to bring them through to the societal side, mediated by its effect on ecosystems and where other organisms live.
Gabriel, you had made references to sort of an increase of paleo data and the confidence that scientific community can speak on this data. First, could you kind of walk us through, what some of this is, ways in which you can use data coming from a period where we obviously have no observation from that period, and what's been developing recently in this area?
There is a broad field of paleoclimate research. So paleo refers to essentially prehistorical, before written formal records. And there are a number of ways to infer what the state of aspects of climate were in different times. These usually require very, very careful work. A lot of this is geological evidence. You could imagine, one of the main ways to look at paleoclimate is to look at the isotopic composition of different shells that sink to the bottom of the ocean. So, for example, there's different types of oxygen. There's oxygen that has slightly more neutrons and slightly fewer neutrons. And the amount of that, the oxygen with more neutrons that goes onto an organism as the shell forms, is different in different temperatures. And we know generally how this functions. And so what you can look for is in ocean sediments or in lake sediments or even land sediments, you can look for this chemical composition. You can look in different strata that allows you to go back in time, because sediment tends to accumulate from the top down, and look at the isotopic composition of these shells. And that will let you see how temperature has changed in the past. You do these at a number of different locations. You also do it over a period in which you have thermometers overlapping, so you can calibrate your data. That's one of the ways that allows you to go back in time. There's a number of other sort of geochemical ways of understanding the structure of climate in the past, so that the community's understanding of past climate records, their ability to integrate those with modern climate records, which are done in generally totally different ways with thermometers, has grown in recent times. And so it allows us to be much more confident about the statement that the recent warming, the rate of warming of our planet over the last 100 years is truly outside of anything that we think has happened over the past 2,000 years. That is a much more confident statement in this IPCC report than in others. And it comes from, and this is, I think, something that's important to underscore about the IPCC report. It is not sort of just a single report. It is a report of reports. It compiles the entire scientific literature on the topic over the last decade and synthesizes what are the common threads, what are the pieces that the scientific knowledge is converging on. Also, for me as a researcher, one of the more important pieces is what are we still not sure about? What, after all these decades of hard work, do we still not know? And that's where I'm going to put my next effort. But I think the policymakers, I think, have plenty on their plate from what we think we understand. I just briefly say here, so I think it's important to note that many of the statements that are becoming more clear in this IPCC report do fall under what I would put the general banner of perhaps alarming, maybe scary. But I think that it's important not to lose ourselves too much in that direction, but to realize that there are actions that society can choose to take now that will influence the trajectory of global warming and the consequences that humanity will have. So we do not want to overemphasize how alarming they are. That should be a cause for action, a cause for decision, but there are actions we can take. And this is really the important part. I am a hopeful person. I think that humanity has the possibility and I think that we will come together in some way and blunt the worst aspects of what is to come. And through some combination of adaptation, but also what we call mitigation, reducing the rate of greenhouse gas increases. And, in addition to, I'm really looking forward to the third report, the part of because that one is the one that focuses on technologies and on policies and on sort of how are we going to deal with this?
You're listening to Scholar Circle, scholarcircle.org. We're discussing the IPCC 6th Assessment Report with Jen Allan of University of Cardiff, Gabriel Vecchi of Princeton University, Stephen Palumbi of Stanford University, and Pam Chasek of Manhattan College. So Jennifer Allan, sort of following on that question, I know you've done work on the impact the NGO community has had on our understandings about climate change and generally on global governance. How has this been received? And in particular, the idea of so many more inputs that aren't necessarily just governmental inputs that go into the IPCC report. Who's contributing to the report? Are there any particular areas that we're starting to see, a greater understanding, a greater part of the conversation about what needs to be done?
It's actually been an interesting relationship between the NGO community and IPCC reports, because a lot of interesting NGOs that are drawing attention to the gender dynamics of climate impacts or Indigenous peoples, or the development gains that we might lose because of, now this twin combination of COVID and climate change. A lot of those NGOs first started to realize that climate change was an issue for them and for their issues because of the IPCC. So it wasn't that they originally were looking around for something else to do necessarily, but they realized that through IPCC reports that there were potentially differences in how vulnerability was going to be experienced by different communities. And they realized we need to get in on this. And so a lot of the NGOs that we see around the climate meetings that happen every year in normal times, the usually annual climate meetings, I guess, a lot of those newer NGOs that we see first realized that climate change is an issue for them because of the work of science and because of the work of climate scientists. So it's sort of like a pull, I guess, into climate work that really diversified the civil society presence there. And since then, a lot were kind of content to hang out in the policy circles of the UN system. And it's been very recently, maybe around the 1.5 degree report from a couple of years back, that they started actually participating more in IPCC meetings and starting to put out calls, especially to social scientists, to start looking at and contributing more on maybe some of the gender dynamics. And so a lot of think tanks have been active there. Also, a lot of NGOs that focus on health issues and health and climate change have been working, perhaps publishing in The Lancet, for example, and using outlets such as that to also work through and get included in IPCC reports. The reception's been interesting. And one of the things I've seen, I've been curious actually to see what Stephen and Gabriel say about this, because there's a huge focus these days on net zero and net zero targets. And one thing I've seen a lot of NGOs, especially in sort of the climate justice communities, saying, and they're a bit net zero skeptical, so I guess I'll preface this, is that one of the main findings from the IPCC report, or one of the findings, is that if we're in a high emission scenario, the ocean and forests aren't going to be effective or as effective at soaking up carbon dioxide. They won't be as good of sinks as we hope they will be. And that net zero targets maybe aren't factoring this in and might be a problem. So personally, I'm just curious, since I happen to have you two in front of me, what you would think about that. But it seems like a really important potential policy implication of this report.
Great question, Jen. Stephen, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, I don't know that I can be as geo as Gabriel can, and maybe he'll have more to say, but the oceans are an incredible sink for heat right now. A good fraction of the extra heat that the planet is under is actually in the oceans. And that's really kind of good news, because it takes it maybe out the air, but it's still there. It's still in the oceans. And as they get warmer, then they'll be able to take in slightly less. Same as true of CO2. The ability to dissolve CO2 in water goes down as the water goes warmer. And I don't really have the numbers in front of me about what that means in terms of the net zero conversation that you were talking about. I will say, though, that from the biological side, that net zero emissions is just the beginning. And at net zero, there is still lots of extra CO2 in the atmosphere, and bringing that down is a long-term process. And so those of us sort of in the biological realm are sort of looking at this as kind of like stopping distance. If you're driving a car, put your foot on the brake, great, you might not be accelerating anymore, but you're not stopped either, and it takes a while to stop. And that stopping distance, in our case for CO2 in the atmosphere, is decades, 50 years, maybe even longer. Maybe Gabriel has a up-to-date notion about that. And in that period of time, even after net emissions go way down, we still have a climate problem. And then a lot of our work, and a lot of the work for people in sort of in the ecosystem sphere, is how do we get through the next 80 years? How do we keep ecosystems functioning so they support human societies and biodiversity for that period of time, so that things begin to get better after that? But our job, as conservation biologists say, is to preserve as much as possible, keep it going through that period of time. That's become a really interesting extra sort of job for the planet, is supporting everyone who is pushing emission reduction, supporting everyone who's supporting human mitigation and adaptation of societies, but also supporting natural biodiversity to get it through this crisis.
So, Gabriel, please.
I would add that, the net zero target and the way it can be estimated, there may be some issues with sort of reduced efficiency going forward by the ocean and land biosphere and taking up carbon. At the same time, I think that the first step, what do they say, when you're in a hole, you first stop digging. Maybe even before that, stop digging as fast, right? And so I think that it's important to, while aiming for the best, not let the good or the best be the enemy of the good. right? And so if we can come up with mitigation strategies that reduce the future impact of global warming, the impact of global warming on the lives of our children, the lives of our grandchildren, the lives of our friends' children and friends' grandchildren, then I think that would be a benefit, and it would also buy us some time to get to the best, right? That said, we are in the pipeline. We have experienced climate change. We have not experienced all the climate change that will arise from the greenhouse gases that we have already emitted. And so we are going to have to learn how to live in a changing climate. And we're going to, I think there are, although that may seem like a large challenge, but it is also, I think, an opportunity. I think that the structures that we have to put in place to predict the environmental changes that we will need to adapt to, the technologies that we will have to develop, the governmental structures, the financial structures that we have to put in place, our understanding of the ecosystems and the ways we interact with them that we will have to develop in order to adapt to climate change, will also help us be better able to live in the climate that we just are leaving, and whatever climates we land in the future, whatever freak events happen, whatever other challenges come our way, because these are efforts, I think, that eventually just build resilience. And when you build when you, so there's certain, for example, physical exercises like doing push-ups that you can do that will strengthen you in a very general sense, that are sort of transferable to a number of sports and a number of activities. And I think that adapting to climate change is going to be that type of task for society. It will be challenging. There will be times that we'll wake up in the morning, we won't want to do it because it'll be hard. But I think there will be a payoff in the end. And not just that we will be better adapted to the future climate change, but that there will be downstream effects across society.
And Pam Chasek, on this question about net zero versus beyond, I guess there's a part of me thinking that a number of the major emitters have done next to nothing. And we're kind of talking about going well beyond, this idea of net zero to something, even more striking. And so I guess part of it is the political question of trying to get every nation on board to at least start working towards net zero, while also giving the message that this is not going to go far enough. How do we navigate that challenge? So there's a number of countries that don't even want to acknowledge the need for net zero.
Well, if we knew the answer to that, I think we'd be in much better political shape. But the challenge is that you have to look at climate change on multiple levels. You have to look at it from the corporate level. You have to look at it from national level, even subnational. Because we see even in the United States, different states are taking different approaches in lieu of having a national plan. And then how do you get the international community on board when every country's, yes, this is something that will affect all of us in different ways, but countries are still looking out for their own best interests. So as Stephen was saying about Micronesia, small island developing states are in fear of loss of everything. Forget loss of sovereignty, for loss of territory, loss of where are their people going to go. Major oil and gas and coal producers, those countries look at it from a more economic point of view, is first of all, if we're going to change the source of energy, how are we going to do that? How are we going to take those who work in these industries and retrain them to work in renewables so we don't have a major unemployment problem? And also, how are we going to navigate those companies who often in many countries have a very strong presence and a lot of influence on government officials. You also have to look at, as Jen noted with NGOs, the health impacts. What health impacts are we seeing? How many more people are dying due to extreme heat, due to storms, due to forest fires? What's that human aspect, and how do we balance that? And so it's a really fine balancing act where it's very easy to say, in theory, we need to, cut down dramatically or eliminate CO2 emissions, which is what the IPCC Working Group 1 said. They focused on CO2 rather than other greenhouse gases because the science was there. This was something that was asked by Saudi Arabia throughout this set of negotiations. They wanted to change every reference to CO2 to be greenhouse gas emissions in general. And the scientists argued back, no, we don't have the data on some of these other greenhouse gases that we have on CO2 emissions. But it's easy to say we need to eliminate CO2 emissions, whether it's through carbon capture and storage, whether it's through the carbon sinks, other way, or not burning fossil fuels. But as soon as you get in the political and economic side of it, it gets very, very complicated. And not to mention that for most of us, we still rely on fossil fuels for our day-to-day lives. Some of us rely on it less now if we're particularly, if you're driving an electric vehicle, if you are able to charge your electric vehicle from solar that you happen to have at home, if all the solar charging, all of the charging stations, what are they fueled by? Which is another issue. And do you even have the ability to charge electric vehicles in your communities? And so, and then, where are you getting, what are you cooking with? Where, are you using, do you have natural gas? Do you have a gas stove? Do you have an electric stove? Where's your electricity coming from? Do you have an option of where that electricity is coming from? Do you have an option to use mass transit? So many, can you cycle to work? A lot of people can't. So there's a lot of these issues that in our lifestyles that need to change, as well as in our political and economic calculus.
So Stephen Palumbi, kind of want to focus at this point on questions about mitigation versus adaptation. How much should the focus be on trying to reduce greenhouse gases, reducing CO2, methane, et cetera? Since we've already kind of outlined that there are going to be climate change effects, even if we were to completely alter, say, energy use tomorrow. And you had highlighted, for example, the access to fresh water being threatened in Micronesia. So I guess part of this is how much should our focus be on adaptation? Climate change is here and we need to address it, and building resilience to that versus mitigation, trying to decrease the contributions to climate change.
For me, my personal opinion is that both are absolutely required. And in this sort of order, without mitigation, climate change would become not only a problem you had to adapt to, but you had to try to figure out how to survive. And it would become more and more and more catastrophic to not only the ecosystems that people depend on, but those human communities and the structures therein. So for example, coral reefs are affected by ocean warming in a huge extent. A small change in extreme temperatures can kill them, reducing their ability to support human communities. Hundreds of millions of people depend upon them for food every single day. Similarly for forests, grasslands, marshes, those kinds of natural services, ecosystem services that are provided to people are really a crucial part of the planet. How that is affected by climate change is pretty strong right now. And a strong mitigation net zero program is actually, in my opinion, desperately needed to keep those ecosystems within the realm of how they can function. Once you're in the process of doing that, you still have another job, which is the adaptation job. And here's where, if you do the mitigation, if we manage to get that happening, then the adaptation job is still there, but it is not as extreme as it would be if you just let emissions go on the way they're happening. Pam and Jen can talk about the human side of adaptation. I work on the natural side, the evolutionary side of adaptation. Can natural ecosystems adapt at least a little to the coming climate change? And can we help them? Can we actually make ecosystems more resilient by various kinds of interventions in them so that they have a better chance of surviving longer into the next century? All of that ability to do that at the adaptation, at the evolutionary or the society level, in my opinion, depends on how big a job you're being given. And if there's no mitigation, in my opinion, the job is too big. It's catastrophic. But with mitigation, it's something that we begin to wrap our hands around and move forward with.
And Gabriel, a lot of your research focuses on the impact of the major weather events, et cetera, being driven by climate change. I mean, I imagine without further mitigation, those weather events are just going to keep getting worse and worse and worse, and are more frequent. So how much attention should be paid to try to figure out a way to address that question versus the obvious adaptation issue of, we need to make communities capable, resilient to be able to manage some of these events?
I see it as a yes and situation. We will have a much easier time adapting to a climate that comes to us after substantial mitigation. If climate change continues unmitigated, we will have a more and more difficult time adapting in ways that we will find comfortable. That said, I think no matter what happens, we will have to adapt, and we will adapt. But I think the divergence is between a pathway of sort of deliberate adaptation in which we take agency, in which we choose what the paths available to us are and which ones are preferable, and an adaptation that happens to us, right? In which we no longer have certain options in front of us. And so to that extent, mitigation is a part of adaptation. It is giving us more options in the future for adaptation. Now, a lot of the tools and ideas that we would implement for adaptation would actually make us more resilient to the types of weather events that would have happened even without global warming. So it is a positive in that regard. I would think, there's a lot of aspects to adaptation. Some of them are the types of things that perhaps come to mind immediately: hardening seawalls, planting different types of crops. But others may be not obvious when you first start thinking about it, but building better weather forecast models, right? If we can better forecast the weather, then we can have better response to these extreme events that may be new to us. If we have better financial systems to distribute risk, then maybe sort of the consequences of certain events aren't as catastrophic. If we have sort of better ways of redistributing water, either through food or other ways, then those are all ways to adapt. There are many ways to adapt, and here's where I think that is a potential, really intellectually rewarding potential for students that are right now, or I'm thinking in university because that's where I'm sitting right now, but also younger kids that are coming up to think creatively about how to structure the society of the future, because once you start moving things around, and I think we've seen this over the past year, there have been many challenges, and I don't want to minimize the challenges that we've gone through over this past year and a half, but I think in adapting to an unusual situation, we've sort of opened ourselves up to reimagining certain aspects of our lives. And hopefully, once we are out of the deepest depths of this past year and a half, we will keep some of that and use that we've sort of reimagined the future that we can have, to lead to sort of a better future for us, so the future that we're much more comfortable with, and it's not one that we just sort of get to through inertia, right? So thinking of adaptation frees us.
Now, Pam Chasek, one of the concerns I've always had, kind of a political concern here, is when the focus is on adaptation, it seems to be at least partially a pass on mitigation. We're seeing here in the United States, for example, I'm hearing stories that the Republican Party, which has been extremely skeptical of even the existence of climate change, are saying they're addressing climate change by focusing on adaptation rather than mitigation. And is the way I framed this question may very well be, purposely problematic, because politically we have a tendency to frame it as mitigation or adaptation. By framing it that way, is this an excuse to do nothing about mitigation by focusing on adaptation?
Well, I'm going to echo what the others have said, and I'm sure Jen can add some more on this about at the climate change negotiations themselves, but you have to do both. That, for some countries that are focusing on adaptation, for example, small island developing states, lying in coastal communities, they have to focus on adaptation. In fact, many of them contribute very little to climate change. And mitigation, while they should contribute to it, is not their number one priority. Here in the United States, we have to focus on both. And we also have to remember that it's not just sea level rise. So this is not something just for quote unquote coastal elites to deal with. Florida is very much at risk here, as well as, the middle of the country, farming and what the impact that this is having on agriculture, forest fires throughout the West, but also in other parts of the country that are not used to seeing them. It affects everyone, and we have to look at both of them hand in hand. How are we going to address adaptation on a community by community basis based on what you need? You don't need a seawall if you're in Bismarck, North Dakota, but you may need to address other, agriculture issues. Also, North Dakota is a big producer of, natural gas and oil, and they have to, which has been the only thing saving their economy right now. So you have to look at both the mitigation and adaptation. And I don't think you should look at adaptation as a pass on mitigation, but a reality, because our mitigation is not going to happen fast enough.
You're listening to Scholar Circle, scholarcircle.org. We're discussing the impact of climate change and the need for future action with Jen Allan of the University of Cardiff, Gabriel Vecchi of Princeton University, Stephen Palumbi of Stanford University, and Pam Chasek of Manhattan College. And what Pam had just said, she's anticipating the next, sort of the last section I'd really like to focus on. So Jen Allan, I'll ask you, these IPCC reports are clearly intended to have an impact on future climate action. And we have a very specific arena for future climate action with the upcoming meetings in Glasgow. What can we expect would be on that agenda? And is there a sense of alarm of the need for much more decisive action in Glasgow rather than simply relying on, well, let's just reinforce the Paris Climate Accords?
It's interesting. So I'll start with your question, assuming that Glasgow goes ahead. We're less than 100 days away, but given vaccine inequities, the need for many delegates from, I'm sitting in the UK, so we call some countries red list countries if they currently have an outbreak. So they will have to self-isolate for 10 days on arrival at extraordinarily high prices at Glasgow for the hotels. So a lot of delegates are saying they simply can't come, that with all of the various needs to self-isolate and the fewer flights that are available these days, it would take them up to a month to get there and a month to get home. And so it's still possible that this meeting might not happen or might be postponed again to next year. This might not be popular, but I don't know if that's a bad thing. what's on the actual negotiation agenda for Glasgow is basically making sure everyone continues and to interpret the Paris Agreement in the same way. We're finishing up the rules, essentially, like the kind of detailed rule book that helps support the Paris Agreement. So what will national reports look like? How can we design a market mechanism that will let countries trade credits of carbon in a way that still makes sure that we're not counting the same emissions reduction twice, for example, or that market actually leads to reducing emissions globally. It's all a lot of detailed technical work. And the big thing of the Paris Agreement, the engine that makes the Paris Agreement work, is countries' pledges, their nationally determined contributions. And most of those are in. They were actually due February of 2020. A lot of countries missed that deadline. The deadline was extended due to COVID to December 2020. Most countries hit that one. And then more came in April, and we're hoping for a few more. But most G20 countries, except for China and India, have their NDCs in. We know what it looks like. We know that they lead to about 2.4 degrees of global warming if they're fully implemented. We don't need a meeting for leaders to send in a new NDC. Like, there's nothing on the agenda that says, please show up in person and hand us an envelope with your pledge on it. It's an email to the Secretariat, and maybe a nice public event. A press conference always helps. The other big thing that would help reduce emissions and build resilience is for developed countries to meet their 10-year-old promise to provide 100 billion a year. Best counts were around, optimistically, 80. Some estimates put us more at 65. And so that also doesn't need a meeting. That needs a press conference and some checks. So if countries came forward, because most of the action happens at the national level according to the Paris Agreement, so if countries came forward and updated their NDCs, and if developed countries said we're going to pledge more to the Green Climate Fund, postponing Glasgow wouldn't make that much of a difference. So the magic of these big meetings happens by getting people kind of shoulder to shoulder and bringing in the businesses and generating the buzz and all of that. But at the end of the day, we need better NDCs and we need finance. And so those things don't need a huge global meeting.
Pam Chasek, it wasn't the real challenge of postponing Glasgow, last year, because the pandemic gives this kind of inherent political message that, first of all, the pandemic may be more important than climate change, or there's a sense that we can delay this a bit because maybe climate change is not as big of a deal, et cetera. Yeah.
I think it's an equity issue. That not saying that COVID is more important, but saying that if all countries can't be at the literal, figurative table, then it's not fair. And if countries have to quarantine and spend so much money, and there's far fewer international flights right now, it's a challenge to get to Glasgow. When think beyond the United States, think to all of these small countries around the world who could easily cry foul if a meeting takes place without their ability to participate, and that could delay things even more. The other issue, though, that we have to remember is that certain naysayers who are trying to slow down action on climate change would be perfectly happy to postpone this another year. But as Jen said, the real nuts and bolts of what has to happen are not going to be made in Glasgow. Glasgow, if it happens, will come out with a lot of political announcements, a lot of words. The question will still be action. And if Glasgow happens without every country being able to be there, or to have somebody represent their interests there that knows what they're talking about. I mean, you can always send your diplomats who are based in the UK who know nothing about climate change to keep the seat warm. But there's still some challenges with having that meeting, as Jen pointed out. And so, but I think, you have to remember all of the things going on within the UN system about, one country, one vote, even though they don't vote in climate change. But every country can be represented there.
An obvious follow-up, why not hold it virtually?
Well, my paper, I'm doing revise and resubmit on that right now. No, but one of the challenges of holding these meetings virtually is that you're limiting the number of hours. As I've seen at some recent meetings, people are zoomed out. And at the same time, it gives what could be decided by a very nice little huddle in the back of the room, or the ability for delegates to talk to each other over coffee or to work things out. That's much tougher in a virtual format. Recent negotiations that we just had, actually the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm, the chemical conventions, they just did a successful attempt at having small huddles and contact group meetings taking place during their negotiations, but they put a lot of the heavy lifting topics for next year. Most of the UN bodies that have met over this last year have postponed the more difficult things. With climate change, they have to finish the Paris rulebook. The issue on market mechanisms that Jen could elaborate far better than I could, which has been holding things up with the Paris rulebook, won't get resolved virtually, largely because some countries, and we can guess at who they are, would say, no, we can only take these decisions in person.
So Stephen and Gabriel, I'm going to ask you both the same question as we're coming to a close. So this will be the last question. Stephen, I'll ask you first. Since the spirit of the IPCC is the scientific community speaking to policymakers and decision makers about action, what do you think, if you were able to attend the Glasgow meetings, would ultimately be the message that you would want to give to policymakers on dealing with climate change?
That's a great question. Tricky, right? But I guess where I would go is that the IPCC report now actually has this really interesting component of it, in which you could go back and look to see what the first IPCC report said and compare it, and they were right. A huge number of those initial projections of what climate change was going to do and how it was going to affect the world basically have come to pass. And so the ability of this scientific enterprise to actually show what the facts are and then project them into the future, I think has been, incredibly much more sophisticated now and shown to be true. That said, if I was going to go there and say, here's the position of me, it's like, stop emitting CO2 by 2050, done. Go to negative after that, pull down as much as we can. Yes, it will cause a lot of things to change, but in fact, we're asking future generations to change no matter what, because they're going to have to change dealing with our CO2 pollution or our CO2 solutions. And I would rather ask them to change for solutions. That would be my pitch if I was in Glasgow by myself, I guess, just talking about these issues.
Gabriel, we have about a minute left. What would you say?
So I'd say that, as the IPCC report makes very clear, the scientific basis for action on climate change is clearer than ever. And also, as we see in all the technologies that are available around us, the ability to act on climate change has never been more possible. And so the time is right. The best moment to plant a tree is 30 years ago, and the best moment to start mitigating climate change is right now.
Absolutely. Thank you all very much. We've been discussing the IPCC reports, the impact of climate change, the need for public action, and the upcoming Glasgow meetings. Our panel has been Jennifer Allan, lecturer in international relations in the School of Law and Politics at Cardiff University. She's the author of the new Climate Activism, NGO Authority and Participation in Global Climate Governance. Gabriel Vecchi professor in the Department of Geosciences and the director of the High Meadows Environmental Institute at Princeton University. He's the author of Causes of Large Projected Increases in Hurricane Precipitation Rates with Global Warming. Stephen Palumbi, Jane and Marshall Steele Jr. Professor in Marine Sciences at Stanford University and the Harold A. Miller Director of the Hopkins Marine Station. He is the co-author of Using Naturally Occurring Climate Resilient Corals to Construct Bleaching Resistant Nurseries, as well as many other articles. And Pamela Chasek, Professor and Chair of the Political Science Department at Manhattan College. She is the author of Global Environmental Politics. Thank you all very much for joining us.
Thank you to our guests and to you for listening. The Scholars Circle team includes Doug Becker, host, Ankine Agasian and Melissa Chiprin, managing producers, Sad Dongre, our webmaster. I'm Maria Armoudian, and we'll see you next week.